The quiet hum of the diner seemed like any other morning, a blend of the sizzling grill, the clinking of silverware, and the murmur of patrons lost in their morning routines. But today, something felt different. A sense of tension lingered in the air, unnoticed by most, but palpable to those who could sense it. At the counter, an elderly man sat, his back slightly hunched from years of life's wear and tear, his weathered hands resting on the table. His suit, though simple, was well kept, and his eyes held a story, one of wisdom and experiences that no one else in the room could fully comprehend. He waited patiently, his gaze never leaving the menu in front of him. He had been coming to this diner for years, and though it wasn't anything fancy, it was comfortable. But today, as he sat waiting for service, he felt an odd discomfort creeping in. A young waitress, no more than 19 or 20, stood behind the counter, eyes scanning the room. Her name tag read Emily, but the sharp, almost dismissive look she gave the elderly man was more than just casual indifference. It was something colder, something unspoken, that made her hesitate before approaching him. The elderly man didn't know what it was about him that made her pause, but as she finally walked towards him, the weight of the moment seemed to settle between them. He gave her a polite nod, his gentle smile reflecting a calm that he had carried with him for decades. But Emily, with her arms crossed and a set jaw, didn't return the smile. She glanced at him and then quickly looked away, her body language cold and distant. "Can I help you?" Emily asked, her voice lacking warmth. It wasn't the usual friendly tone she gave to customers, and the man noticed it immediately. He raised an eyebrow, his hand resting on the edge of the table. "I'll have the usual, thank you," he said, his voice calm, though a faint hint of confusion edged in. He had never been treated this way before. But Emily didn't move. Instead, she stood there for a moment, eyeing him as if considering something he couldn't quite place. It was an awkward silence that stretched far too long, and the elderly man felt a discomfort growing in his chest. After a beat, Emily's response came, and it wasn't what anyone would have expected in a diner like this. "I'm sorry," Emily said sharply, her eyes flicking to the side as she spoke. "I can't serve you." Her words hung in the air, as the restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade into the background. She didn't apologize, nor did she offer an explanation. She simply turned, ready to walk away, as though her refusal was an unquestionable act. The elderly man's face tightened in disbelief. Was she serious? His mind raced, but he couldn't find the words at first. He wasn't sure if this was an unfortunate misunderstanding, or something far deeper. He thought about asking if she was just having a bad day, or if perhaps she was new. But the coolness in her demeanor made him rethink that notion entirely. Before he could speak, the diner's door opened, and the familiar sound of the bell chimed. A woman, mid-30s, entered. Her presence was commanding yet graceful, and she immediately locked eyes with the elderly man. It was as if she knew something was wrong, something he didn't yet fully grasp. The woman walked with purpose, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she approached him. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath in that moment, as all eyes shifted to her. The elderly man, still seated at his table, couldn't help but notice the subtle tension in the room. He watched the woman carefully as she moved toward him. It wasn't until she reached the table that the air truly shifted. "Is everything okay here?" the woman asked, her voice steady, yet her eyes burning with quiet intensity. Emily looked up, startled, almost guilty, as if she were caught in a lie. The young waitress shifted uncomfortably on her feet, but she didn't answer. The woman's gaze lingered on the waitress for a moment, and then it softened when she turned her attention to the elderly man. He looked up at her, confused but still composed, his confusion growing with each passing second. "I'm sorry," the woman continued, her voice filled with an unusual calm. "I'm afraid there's been a mistake." She addressed Emily directly now, her tone unyielding. "This man is a regular here. He's a respected member of this community, and he's never been treated this way." Emily's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced between the woman and the elderly man. There was something about the woman's presence that was different. It wasn't just authority. It was a quiet strength, a certain recognition in her expression that made Emily hesitate. The woman's gaze never faltered, and the young waitress slowly began to realize that this wasn't a situation she could just brush off. But the shock hadn't worn off yet. Why was this elderly man important? Enough to warrant such a confrontation? The elderly man, sensing the rising tension, took a deep breath and slowly stood up, his back straightening despite the years of wear. The moment he stood, The woman's demeanor shifted. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm, offering him a reassuring touch that seemed to calm him, though the storm still raged inside. "I'm sorry," Emily said again, but this time it lacked conviction. She was now fully aware that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. But it wasn't her apology that stunned everyone. It was the woman's next words. "You might want to rethink your actions, Emily," the woman said, her voice low but unmistakably powerful. "This is my father, and I don't think you fully understand who you're dealing with." The words hung in the air, echoing louder than anything else that had happened in that diner. Emily's eyes widened, her face pale. She had been so sure of herself, so certain that she could make a snap judgment, but the shock of the woman's revelation sent her reeling. The elderly man's daughter. But who was she really? The connection wasn't immediately clear, but there was something about the woman's words, something about the way she carried herself that made Emily feel suddenly small. The woman stood there, unwavering, her eyes meeting Emily's with a mixture of disappointment and resolve. It was clear now. The situation had escalated, but this wasn't just about service. It was about respect, dignity, and the power of being seen for who you truly were. As Emily stood there, struggling to find the right words, the elderly man's daughter continued, her voice now rising just a bit. "It's not too late to make things right. But I think you owe him an apology, don't you?" With those words, the diner fell silent, and the quiet tension built once again. What would Emily do next? Would she apologize, or would she dig her heels in and stand by her decision? Whatever came next, it was clear this wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding. It was about something far deeper, something much more significant. And as the room waited for her response, no one knew just how far this moment would go. The atmosphere in the diner hung thick with tension. Emily, still standing at the counter, hadn't moved an inch. Her face was flushed with a mix of confusion and disbelief. But something deeper was stirring inside her, a sense of realization. The woman who had approached the elderly man was not just any customer. There was an authority in her stance, a quiet strength that made it impossible for Emily to dismiss the situation. Her heart pounded as she tried to piece together the pieces of this puzzle. For a moment, the silence was deafening. The elderly man, who had been so composed throughout the entire interaction, didn't speak. Instead, his daughter, his own flesh and blood, stood beside him with the kind of poise that made it impossible to ignore her presence. Emily's mind raced. Who was this woman? What kind of power did she hold? And more importantly, why had she decided to make herself known now, at this moment? Was this just a coincidence, or was there something more to this encounter than she realized? The elderly man's daughter, though calm on the surface, was clearly grappling with emotions of her own. She had witnessed the way Emily had treated her father, and the sting of that treatment cut deep. This wasn't just a matter of poor service. It was a matter of respect, of dignity. She had been raised to understand the importance of standing up for people who were mistreated, especially when it came to those who had been through so much in their lives. Her father, despite the years of hardship he had endured, had always been a man who commanded respect simply by being himself. But in that moment, in this diner, he had been reduced to something less, something no one should have to endure. The woman's thoughts flashed back to her own childhood, to the stories her father had told her about growing up in a time when the world didn't always show kindness to people like him. She thought about the struggle, the dignity, and the resilience he had carried with him through every challenge. Her heart ached for him now. But there was something more in her heart, too, something that gave her the strength to confront the waitress, to stand up in this moment when everything was on the line. She couldn't let this woman, Emily, get away with this. Not when it was clear that this wasn't just a simple mistake, but a deeper, more ingrained attitude that she couldn't ignore. "Apologize," the woman repeated, her voice low but unwavering. "It's the least you can do." Emily's eyes darted back and forth between the elderly man and his daughter. She had been caught off guard by the woman's revelation. She had no idea who they were. She had no idea that the man sitting at the table was someone with a history that went far beyond what she could see in front of her. To her, he had just been another elderly man, a stranger in her section. But now, everything had changed. Her world was shifting under her feet, and the weight of her actions was starting to settle in. I didn't know," Emily stammered, her voice small. Her bravado, which had kept her in control earlier, was now crumbling. "I didn't mean." "Meaning is not enough." The woman cut her off, her voice sharp now, the edge of authority in it clear for everyone to hear. You've treated him like he doesn't matter. Like he doesn't deserve the same respect as anyone else in here." She paused, letting her words sink in, her gaze never leaving Emily's. "It's not just about the food, Emily. It's about how you see people. And right now, you've shown us exactly how you see him." The woman's words hung in the air, leaving Emily speechless. She had no idea how to respond. A rush of guilt flooded her chest, and she could feel her face turning red. She had acted without thinking, dismissing the elderly man not because of anything he had done, but because of assumptions she had made. Assumptions that now seemed painfully wrong. But it wasn't just about her mistake in this one moment. It was about the deeper issue that her actions had highlighted: the prejudice, the lack of respect, and the assumption that some people weren't worthy of basic decency. Emily didn't know it, but she had just been confronted with something far larger than her own embarrassment. The elderly man, whose silence had been so heavy up until now, finally spoke. His voice, though soft, carried an authority that made every word seem measured and deliberate. "You have a choice, young lady," he said. "A choice to either continue down this path of ignorance or to learn from this moment. It's not about me. This is about how we treat each other. How we decide to see each other no matter who they are or where they come from." The words hit harder than anything Emily could have expected. She had expected to hear an apology, some sort of excuse for the discomfort she had caused. But instead, the elderly man was offering her something she hadn't anticipated: a lesson. A chance to change, to grow. And just like that, the weight of the situation became clear. This wasn't just a confrontation between a customer and a waitress, it was a moment of reckoning. Emily swallowed hard, feeling a lump in her throat. She could see the hurt in the elderly man's eyes, but she could also see something else. Something she hadn't expected: forgiveness. He wasn't angry, but there was a quiet strength in him that made her want to do better, to be better. "I'm sorry," Emily whispered, her voice shaky but sincere. "I never should have treated you that way. I didn't mean to hurt you." The elderly man nodded slowly, accepting her apology without hesitation. "I know you didn't," he said gently, "but now you know better. And that's all anyone can ask." The room remained still for a moment, the diner's usual noise suspended in time. Everyone seemed to be waiting for the next step, the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. The elderly man's daughter turned to him, her gaze softening as she placed a hand on his arm. "I think it's time we go," she said quietly, her voice filled with a tenderness that made it clear she wanted to protect her father from any more discomfort. He had endured so much over his lifetime, and she wasn't about to let anyone diminish the respect he had earned. As they stood to leave, Emily remained rooted to the spot, her mind still reeling. She had learned something important today, something she couldn't forget. The elderly man had shown her what true dignity looked like. And his daughter had given her a chance to see the world through a different lens. One where respect wasn't just a matter of courtesy, but of fundamental human decency. And as they walked out of the diner, Emily found herself wondering how many more moments like this she would encounter in her life. And whether she would choose to learn from them, or ignore them. But for now, all she could do was reflect on the lesson that had been delivered so unexpectedly, but so powerful. As the elderly man and his daughter left the diner, Emily stood frozen in place, her heart still pounding in her chest. She had apologized, but she knew that it wasn't enough. Not just for the elderly man, but for herself too. She had been given a chance to make things right, to learn something valuable, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of her actions settle over her. It wasn't just about one interaction, it was about how she had been living her life, how she had been judging others, how she had allowed herself to be blind to the humanity in those she served every day. As the door closed behind them, the hum of the diner seemed to return, but it wasn't the same. The atmosphere had changed, the air a little heavier, a little more charged with the realization that things could not go back to the way they were. Emily's mind raced, and she found herself questioning everything she had ever assumed about people: their worth, their dignity, their stories. But the story wasn't over yet. The elderly man and his daughter weren't the only ones who had witnessed what happened. There were other patrons in the diner, other people who had seen the interaction unfold, and many of them were watching Emily closely now. It was as if the room was holding its breath, waiting for her to make a move. She could feel their eyes on her, their unspoken judgment still lingering in the air. It was one thing to make a mistake. It was another thing entirely to have the world see it. Emily took a deep breath, wiping her hands on her apron. She had a choice to make now: one that could change everything. She could let the discomfort swallow her, let the guilt define her, or she could choose to stand up and show everyone that she was capable of learning, of changing. It was never going to be easy, but she knew what she had to do. As she turned toward the counter, she noticed the other waitress, Karen, giving her a curious look. Karen had been working there for years, and while they weren't exactly close, Emily knew she could count on her to be honest, even if it meant a harsh truth. "Emily," Karen said, her voice quiet but direct. "You all right?" The question seemed simple, but Emily knew it was more than that. Karen wasn't asking just about her physical well-being. She was asking if Emily was ready to face what had just happened, to reckon with the way she had treated someone who had been nothing but kind. I don't know," Emily replied, her voice shaking just a little. "I've never thought about it like that. I didn't even realize what I was doing. It's just, I've seen so many people like him, you know. And I thought he was just another old man. I didn't see him for who he really was. And now, I don't know what to do." Karen nodded, understanding more than she let on. "It's not easy," she said. "But you're not the first person to make that mistake. And you won't be the last. What matters now is what you do next." Emily took a deep breath, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. The moment she had with the elderly man and his daughter hadn't been just a lesson in respect. It had been a wake-up call. It was easy to forget that people were more than what they seemed on the surface. It was easy to dismiss someone who didn't fit the mold of what society expected, but in doing so, she had failed to see the value of a human being in its most authentic form. That was something she would carry with her now. Something she couldn't erase, but could choose to do better with. "Thanks," Emily said to Karen, her voice steadying. "I think I know what I need to do." With that, Emily walked to the back of the diner and grabbed her coat. She had a decision to make. She wasn't going to let this moment slip away. She wasn't going to pretend that it hadn't happened or bury it down. This was her chance to change, not just for herself, but for the people she interacted with every day. She had made a mistake, but that mistake didn't have to define her. The choice was hers now. Whether she would allow it to propel her forward or keep her stuck in the past. As she stepped out of the diner, the cool air hit her face, the weight of everything still heavy on her shoulders. But there was something different now, something in the way she carried herself that spoke of a quiet resolve. The elderly man and his daughter were long gone, but the lesson they had left behind would stay with her. And as she made her way down the street, Emily couldn't help but reflect on the unexpected power of that moment. A simple yet profound interaction that had opened her eyes to something far greater than just a mistake. It had shown her the power of human connection, of seeing beyond the surface, and of treating everyone with the respect they deserve. The world, she realized, wasn't just black and white. People weren't defined by the labels society placed on them. There was so much more beneath the surface, the stories, the lives, the struggles, and the triumphs that made each person unique. And now, for the first time, Emily truly understood that. As the story unfolded, it wasn't just about an apology or a moment of reckoning. It was about growth, about taking responsibility for our actions and learning from them. It was about the way we treat others, how we see them, and how we can change the world by simply seeing them for who they truly are. The diner, the elderly man, his daughter, and Emily's journey had become something more than just a chance encounter. It was a reminder that every day is an opportunity to be better, to learn, and to make the world a more compassionate place, one small act at a time. And as Emily stepped into her future, she knew that this was only the beginning.